Welcome to episode 144 of Business Growth School for Service Providers. I'm your host Ali Salman, and this podcast is brought to you by Rapid Boost Marketing, online marketing for local service providers. In yesterday's episode 143, we talked about how can you build authority through podcast, and we talked about how podcasting as a medium has grown immensely in last few years, how it can be an amazing traffic generation and lead generation source for your business. In today's podcast, I wanted to talk about basically that if let's say if you have a podcast, how can you get more traffic? How can you grow your podcast? How can you get more downloads? How can you get more people to listen to that, right? So number one thing that about the podcast is you have to make sure that your podcast is distributed everywhere. I mean, like iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, SoundCloud, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and I can go on and on. The idea is that make sure all these syndication platforms have your podcast because they have a massive audience. So you no longer once you put it on iTunes also help you get those listeners. Similarly, Google Play or Spotify or SoundCloud. So make sure that your podcast is listed on all the syndication channels like iTunes and, as we mentioned, other other platforms. Make sure that your podcast have a website or a dedicated page on your existing website where people can go and access the show notes, right? This is the second trick, because most of the people don't have a proper show notes. I mean, someone listened to your podcast, now they want to reflect back, now they want to download something, now they want to basically revisit that page. So make sure that you have a dedicated website or a page for your podcast. Very important, because if you have a dedicated page or a website, you can also get search engine optimization advantage. When you launch your podcast, make sure that you do a big press release for that. You can use different services, but the idea is that you should reach out to all the different press releases, right? Local, international, national media, regional media. And the idea is that they can help you get the name out there. Also, what you can also do is make sure that you're promoting your podcast through social media. Maybe your podcast is mentioned in your Facebook cover page. It also talks about your podcast also talks about your Twitter account, also talks about your podcast. You may have a Snapchat talking about your podcast. So make sure that you're promoting your podcast through social media channels aggressively, right? Also make sure that you can do basically some podcasts where you can actually host podcast with another interviewee or someone who a second person who can also promote your podcast. Let's say a co-host. Example, if you are a mortgage person and you did a podcast with a realtor, and now you both can promote to each other's audience. Similarly, if you're a local dentist and you did a podcast with an orthodontist, both of you can collaborate on promoting your podcast. Okay. Also make sure that your podcast is in your email signature link. Make sure every time you send out an email, people actually can click, because you probably send out 10 to 15 to 20 different emails every day. And imagine over a month you've sent out, let's say, 300 emails. Those were 300 opportunities, right? You could have had for the podcast, right? Also make sure that list yourself in the content discovery apps like Stitcher, Feedly, and things like that. What I've done, I've actually included 75 plus podcast marketing and growth strategies for you guys, which you can access it at rapidboostmarketing.com/grow. Make sure you download that. Make sure you go over that, because it has 75 strategies in depth talking about how can you grow your podcast. A lot of different ideas and tricks and techniques used by established podcasters, also used by us. We have grown this podcast into thousands of listeners every month, right? And it's impressive that the power of podcasting, and you as a local service provider, if you use it effectively, you can actually generate a lot of traffic and a lot of leads for your business. I'll catch you tomorrow bright and early in episode 145 of Business Growth School for Service Providers. I'm your host Ali Salman, and this podcast is brought to you by Rapid Boost Marketing, online marketing for local service providers. Have a good day, make it count. Bye bye.